Jedediah Stone, or Jed as he preferred, existed more than he lived. His days were a cycle of chores, chopping wood, tending a small vegetable patch, and occasionally hunting deer in the surrounding mountains. His cabin, built of rough-hewn logs, stood as a testament to his solitude, perched high on a ridge overlooking a vast, untamed wilderness. It was a place meant to keep the world at bay, and for years it had succeeded. Jed wasn't always this way. Once, he had been a different man, full of laughter and dreams. But the West was a harsh teacher, and Jed had learned its lessons in blood and fire. He rarely spoke of what happened, the memories buried deep beneath layers of stoicism and hard work. The sparkle in his eyes, once bright with hope, had been replaced by a quiet resignation. His silence wasn't born of rudeness, but of pain. Words felt inadequate, clumsy tools unable to express the weight he carried. He preferred the company of the wind whistling through the pines, the babbling brook that ran near his cabin, and the stoic mountains that mirrored his own weathered face. These were companions that asked nothing, demanded nothing, and simply existed alongside him. His cabin was sparsely furnished. A rough-hewn table, a couple of chairs, a bed covered with a thick wool blanket, and a fireplace that served as both cook stove and source of warmth. Every item was practical, chosen for its utility rather than its beauty. The only exception was a small, wooden box hidden beneath his bed, containing a few mementos of his past life, a faded photograph, a tarnished silver locket, and a worn leather-bound book of poems. He rarely looked at them, but he couldn't bring himself to part with them. They were a painful reminder of what he had lost, but also a testament to what he had once been. The mountains were his refuge, his sanctuary. He knew their every path, every hidden valley, every trickling stream. He felt a kinship with the rugged landscape, a sense of belonging that he couldn't find anywhere else. In the silence of the wilderness, he could almost forget the ghosts that haunted him, almost believe that he could find peace. But the past, like the relentless wind, always found a way to return. The storm arrived with a ferocity that mirrored the turmoil within Jed's soul. It wasn't a gentle rain, but a raging torrent, driven by winds that howled like banshees. The sky, once a clear, endless blue, was now a swirling mass of dark gray clouds, pregnant with lightning. The mountains, usually so stoic and reassuring, seemed to shrink under the onslaught, their peaks disappearing into the swirling mist. Jed's cabin, normally a haven, became a fragile speck against the backdrop of the tempest. The wind rattled the windows, threatening to rip them from their frames. Rain lashed against the log walls, seeping through the cracks and creating dark, damp patches on the inside. The fire in the hearth sputtered and hissed, struggling to maintain its warmth against the encroaching cold. The isolation of Jed's cabin was amplified tenfold by the storm. He was completely cut off from the world, surrounded by a maelstrom of wind and rain. The nearest town was a day's ride away, an impossible journey in these conditions. He was alone, utterly and completely alone, with only the storm for company. Each gust of wind seemed to whisper threats. Each flash of lightning illuminated the vulnerability of his existence. The storm was a stark reminder of the power of nature, a force that could crush him without a second thought. It was a test of his resilience, a challenge to his will to survive. The trees surrounding the cabin swayed violently, their branches thrashing against each other like angry fists. The sound was deafening, a constant barrage that pounded against Jed's ears. He could hear the occasional crack of a falling branch, a chilling reminder of the danger lurking just outside his door. He stoked the fire, adding more logs to ward off the encroaching chill. He pulled his wool blanket tighter around his shoulders, seeking comfort in its warmth. He sat in his chair, staring into the flames, lost in thought. The storm raged on, oblivious to his presence, a force of nature indifferent to the fate of a solitary cowboy in his mountain cabin. It was during one particularly violent gust that he thought he heard something else above the din, a faint sound, almost lost in the fury of the storm. The sound, barely audible above the storm's relentless roar, pricked at Jed's conscience. He dismissed it at first, attributing it to the wind or a trick of his imagination. He had learned to ignore the world, to shut out the noise and focus on his own survival. But the sound persisted, a faint, desperate cry that tugged at something deep within him. He hesitated. Opening his door to the storm meant inviting chaos into his carefully ordered world. It meant breaking the self-imposed isolation that had been his shield for so long. It meant confronting the possibility of trouble, of danger, of a disruption to the fragile peace he had managed to carve out for himself. The memories flickered in his mind, the faces of those he had lost, the violence he had witnessed, the pain he had endured. He had turned his back on all of that, seeking solace in solitude. Why would he risk it all now? He closed his eyes, trying to block out the sound, trying to convince himself that it wasn't real. But the image of someone, somewhere, suffering in the storm wouldn't leave him. He knew what it was like to be alone, to be vulnerable, to be at the mercy of the elements. A battle raged within him. The desire to remain hidden, safe, and undisturbed versus the nagging feeling that he couldn't simply ignore a plea for help. The voice of his past, the voice of reason, urged him to stay put. But another voice, a quieter voice, a voice he had almost forgotten, whispered of compassion, of empathy, of a simple human need to help another in distress. Finally, with a sigh of resignation, Jed rose from his chair. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't live with himself if he ignored the cry, and someone perished just outside his door. His conscience, dormant for so long, had finally awakened. He grabbed his rifle, a precaution born of years in the wild, and headed towards the door, steeling himself for whatever he might find. The storm seemed to intensify as he reached for the latch, as if challenging his decision, but he pushed the door open anyway and stepped out into the raging tempest. The wind tore at Jed as he stepped outside, nearly ripping the door from his grasp. Rain lashed his face, blurring his vision. He squinted, scanning the immediate area, his rifle held ready. For a moment, he saw nothing but the swirling chaos of the storm. Then he saw her, collapsed just beyond the edge of his porch. Almost hidden by the overgrown weeds, lay a woman. She was small and slight, her body curled into a fetal position as if trying to protect herself from the elements. Her clothes were soaked through, clinging to her like a second skin. Her hair, plastered to her face, obscured her features. Jed rushed to her side, his boots sinking into the muddy ground. He knelt beside her, his gruff exterior softening with concern. He gently touched her shoulder, and she didn't respond. She was unconscious. He quickly assessed the situation. She was alive, but barely. Her breathing was shallow and ragged, and her skin was ice-cold. He knew he had to get her inside quickly if she was to survive. With a grunt of effort, Jed carefully lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, almost frail. He carried her back to the cabin, his movements hampered by the wind and the rain. He stumbled once, nearly dropping her, but managed to regain his balance. Back inside, he laid her gently on his bed. He quickly closed the door, shutting out the storm and the biting wind. The relative warmth of the cabin felt like a luxury after the brutal conditions outside. As he began to remove her soaked clothing, he noticed that her hand was clenched tightly. He tried to gently pry it open, but her grip was surprisingly strong. He didn't want to force it, fearing he might injure her. He would have to wait until she regained consciousness. But he couldn't help but wonder what she was holding so tightly, what secret she was guarding even in her unconscious state. He knew one thing for sure. This woman's arrival had shattered his peaceful existence, and his life would never be the same. Jed, despite his rough exterior, possessed a surprising gentleness. Years of living in the wilderness had taught him self-reliance, but also a certain tenderness towards living things. He had nursed injured animals back to health, tended to his small garden with care, and even coaxed wildflowers to bloom in unlikely places. Now, that same nurturing instinct kicked in. He worked quickly but carefully, stripping the woman of her wet clothes and wrapping her in a dry blanket. He rummaged through his meager supplies, finding a clean, soft shirt that had belonged to his late wife. It was too big for her, but it would provide some warmth. He stoked the fire, adding more logs until it blazed brightly, casting a warm glow throughout the cabin. He then heated water in a kettle, testing it carefully before soaking a cloth and gently dabbing it on her forehead and neck. Her skin was still cold, but he could feel a faint pulse. He knew that warmth was crucial. He moved a chair closer to the fire and carefully positioned her so that she would benefit from the heat. He continued to tend to her, checking her breathing, wiping her brow, and murmuring soft words of reassurance, even though she couldn't hear him. His movements were efficient and practiced, revealing a competence that belied his solitary existence. It was clear that he had experience dealing with emergencies, that he knew what to do in a crisis. Perhaps he had learned these skills during his former life, before tragedy struck. Or perhaps they were simply innate, a part of his character that had been buried beneath layers of grief and isolation. As he cared for the woman, glimpses of his caring nature emerged. The lines around his eyes softened, and the harshness in his face faded. He looked almost like a different man, a man capable of love and compassion. The woman's presence had stirred something within him, a spark of humanity that he thought had been extinguished long ago. He didn't know who she was or why she had come to his cabin, but he knew that he would do everything in his power to save her. He was no longer just existing. He was actively fighting for someone else's survival, and in doing so, he was perhaps beginning to heal himself. Hours passed, the storm outside gradually losing some of its initial fury, though the rain still fell in sheets. Jed remained by the woman's side, tending the fire and occasionally dabbing her brow with a cool cloth. Finally, she stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, and she groaned softly. Her head moved restlessly on the pillow, and she began to mumble incoherently. Jed leaned closer, straining to hear what she was saying. Her words were slurred and indistinct, almost lost in the crackling of the fire and the drumming of the rain on the roof. He caught snippets of phrases, fragments of sentences that didn't quite make sense. Can't stop them. So close. Then, a word that sent a shiver down his spine. Danger. He leaned even closer, his heart pounding in his chest. Was she delirious? Or was she trying to tell him something important? He needed to understand what she was saying, to decipher the meaning behind her garbled words. Again, she mumbled, her voice barely a whisper. This time, he heard something more distinct, a name. It sounded familiar, too familiar. He couldn't quite grasp it at first, the syllables jumbled and distorted by her weakened state. He held his breath, focusing all his attention on her. She repeated the name, this time with slightly more clarity. And then he heard it, the name that he had tried to bury, the name that represented everything he had lost. Stone Vidadiah, Stone. His blood ran cold. How did she know his name? Why was she saying it? He hadn't used that name in years, not since he had retreated to the mountains to escape his past. Only a handful of people knew his true identity, and they were all gone. He stared at the woman, his mind racing. Who was she? What did she want? And why was she speaking his name, a name that was supposed to be lost forever? The storm outside seemed to pale in comparison to the storm that was now brewing inside him. The past, which he had tried so hard to escape, had suddenly come crashing back into his life. And it had arrived in the form of this mysterious woman, who lay unconscious on his bed, whispering his name into the darkness. The woman's grip on her hand remained tight, a silent testament to the importance of whatever she held. Now that he knew she spoke his name, his real name, Jed felt compelled to know what she clutched so fiercely. He hesitated, not wanting to cause her further distress, but the need to understand her connection to his past outweighed his reservations. He spoke softly to her, his voice low and soothing. "I need to see what you're holding," he murmured, hoping she could somehow understand. He gently stroked her hand, trying to relax her muscles. Slowly, carefully, he began to pry her fingers open, one by one. Her resistance was weaker now, her grip loosening with each passing moment. Finally, her hand opened completely, revealing the object she had been guarding so closely. It was a small, worn piece of leather, rectangular in shape and darkened with age and grime. Jed picked it up, turning it over in his hands. It was crudely made, the edges uneven and the leather stiff. But what caught his attention was the stitching. Uneven, almost childlike stitches formed two words, Jedediah Stone. The letters were faded and worn, but still legible. They were stitched with a thick, dark thread, the kind used for repairing saddles and harnesses. It looked like something a child might have made, a simple gift given with love. Jed stared at the leather patch, his mind reeling. He didn't recognize it. He couldn't imagine who would have made it or why. But the fact that she was carrying it, that she had risked her life to protect it, meant that it held some significance, some connection to him and his past. He felt a wave of confusion wash over him, followed by a surge of fear. His carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. His carefully guarded secrets threatened to be revealed. This woman, this storm, this little piece of leather, they were all harbingers of a past he had desperately tried to escape. He sat back in his chair, stunned and bewildered, the worn leather patch clutched tightly in his own hand. The mystery had deepened, and the answers, he feared, would be more painful than he could ever imagine. The worn leather patch triggered a flood of memories, a torrent of images that crashed over Jed like the storm outside. He closed his eyes, and the cabin faded away, replaced by the vibrant scenes of his past. He saw himself as a young man, full of life and laughter, standing beside his father on the porch of their sprawling ranch house. The stone ranch, it was called, a testament to generations of hard work and dedication. Cattle grazed on the rolling hills, and the air was filled with the scent of wildflowers and the sound of birdsong. He saw his mother, her face etched with kindness, tending to her garden, her laughter echoing through the yard. He saw his younger sister, her eyes sparkling with mischief, chasing butterflies in the meadow. It was a scene of idyllic happiness, a picture of a loving family living the American dream. But the dream was shattered in an instant. One fateful night, bandits descended upon the ranch, their faces hidden behind bandanas, their hearts filled with greed and malice. They came for the ranch's rumored hidden gold, a treasure his father had refused to reveal. The attack was brutal and swift. Jed fought alongside his father, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. He watched in horror as his family was cut down, their lives extinguished in a hail of gunfire. He was left for dead, bleeding and broken, amidst the carnage. When he finally regained consciousness, he was alone. The ranch was in ruins, the air thick with the stench of smoke and death. He buried his family with his own two hands, his heart filled with grief and rage. He knew he couldn't stay. The memories were too painful, the danger too real. He changed his name, adopting the simple moniker of Jed, and fled into the mountains, seeking anonymity and escape. He wanted to disappear, to erase his past, and start anew. He carried the guilt of being the sole survivor, the weight of knowing that he had failed to protect his family. He vowed to never let anyone get close to him again, to never risk experiencing such pain again. And for years, he had succeeded. Until now, until the storm, until this woman, until the worn leather patch that had ripped open the wounds of his past. The memories of his past left Jed shaken, the comfortable solitude of his cabin now a prison of his own making. He was ripped from his thoughts by a soft groan. The woman was awakening. Her eyes fluttered open, filled with confusion and fear. She looked around the cabin, her gaze darting from the fire to Jed, who stood watching her intently. Recognition slowly dawned in her eyes, followed by a fresh wave of terror. Where am I?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over her, and she fell back against the pillow. "You're safe," Jed said, his voice gruff but reassuring. "You're in my cabin. You collapsed outside in the storm." Her eyes widened. "The storm, they're still after me." She clutched the blanket tightly around her, as if trying to shield herself from an unseen threat. "Who's after you?" Jed asked, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. "Men, dangerous men," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been running from them for months. They won't let you know. What I know? Jed asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. I don't know anything worth killing for. Yes, you do, she insisted. You're Jedediah Stone, aren't you? The sole survivor of the Stone Ranch massacre. Jed's heart sank. So she knew. His carefully constructed facade had crumbled. He was no longer just Jed, the solitary cowboy. He was Jedediah Stone, the man with a past, the man with a secret. They think you know where your father hid the gold, she continued. The gold they didn't find when they attacked the ranch. There is no gold, Jed said, his voice low and dangerous. My father never hid any gold. That's what I told them, she said, but they don't believe me. They think I'm working with you, that I know where it is, and I'm leading them to you. And why would you do that? Jed asked, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. Because I believe you, she said, her gaze meeting his. I believe that you don't know anything about any gold. And I believe that those men are evil, and they need to be stopped. She has been searching for him to warn him. The gold is why they will be coming. The woman said her name was Sarah. Jed stared at Sarah, his mind struggling to process everything she was saying. The gold, the men, his past. It was all a tangled web of lies and deceit. But one detail in particular stood out, a detail that sent a fresh wave of anger and disbelief coursing through his veins. Who are these men? He asked, his voice tight with suppressed rage. Who's leading them? Sarah hesitated, her eyes filled with fear. You're not going to like this, she said softly. It's your former ranch foreman, Caleb. Jed recoiled as if he had been struck. Caleb? But Caleb died in the attack. I saw him. I saw him fall. He survived, Sarah said, shaking her head. He was badly wounded, but he survived, and he's been searching for you ever since. You believe your father told you where the gold was hidden before he died. Caleb, the man who had been like a brother to him, the man he had trusted implicitly, the man who had supposedly died defending the ranch. Now, he was alive, and he was leading the very bandits who had destroyed Jed's life. The betrayal cut deep, deeper than any wound he had ever suffered. My father never told me about any gold, Jed said, his voice shaking with emotion. He never trusted me with anything like that. I know, Sarah said, but Caleb doesn't believe it. He thinks you're lying, that you're protecting the gold for yourself. And what does Caleb want with this gold? Jed asked. Revenge, Sarah said. He wants to rebuild the ranch, to restore it to its former glory. But he needs the gold to do it. He's twisted, Jed spat. He's become the very thing he swore to fight against. He's consumed by greed and bitterness, Sarah agreed. He's not the man you remember. Jed fell silent, his mind reeling. Caleb was alive, and he was coming for him. He was coming for the gold that didn't exist. He was coming to finish what he had started years ago. Jed felt a surge of determination rise within him. He wouldn't let Caleb destroy his life again. He would fight back. He would protect Sarah. And he would finally put an end to the nightmare that had haunted him for so long. The revelation about Caleb sent Jed spiraling. Years of carefully constructed detachment threatened to unravel completely. Part of him, the part that had learned to survive by burying the past, screamed at him to run, to disappear once again into the wilderness, to abandon Sarah and let her face her own fate. He could pack his meager belongings, disappear into the mountains, and become a ghost once more. He had done it before. He could do it again. But another part of him, the part that had been reawakened by Sarah's arrival, the part that remembered the values his parents had instilled in him, the part that felt a flicker of hope for the future, refused to let him turn his back on her. She had come to him seeking help, seeking protection. She believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. How could he abandon her to Caleb's ruthless gang? He paced the small cabin, his mind a battlefield of conflicting emotions. The desire to remain hidden, safe from the pain of his past, warred with his growing obligation to protect Sarah and confront the demons that had haunted him for so long. He wrestled with his inner demons, the guilt of surviving when his family had perished, the fear of losing everything again, the anger at Caleb for betraying him and defiling the memory of the ranch. He thought of his father, of the values he had taught him: courage, loyalty, and compassion. He knew what his father would have done. He would have stood his ground. He would have protected the innocent. He would have fought for what was right. Jed stopped pacing and looked at Sarah, who was watching him with a mixture of concern and hope. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw a spark of resilience, a determination to survive. He knew that he couldn't let her down. He made his decision. He would stay. He would fight. He would confront Caleb and his gang. He would protect Sarah, and he would finally put an end to the past that had been chasing him for so long. But doing this would not be easy, and he knew this. The storm outside the cabin was nothing compared to the storm inside him. It was going to take everything he had to make this happen, but he would give everything he had. The decision made, Jed's movements became purposeful, his demeanor shifting from haunted recluse to determined protector. He realized he could no longer run from his past. It had found him, and it was time to face it. He had spent years trying to bury Jedediah Stone, but the truth was Jedediah Stone was still inside him, waiting to be awakened. He started by checking his rifle, ensuring it was clean and loaded. He examined his ammunition, making sure he had enough to withstand a prolonged siege. He had learned long ago that preparation was key to survival in the Wild West. He then turned his attention to the cabin, reinforcing the windows and barricading the door. He moved furniture to create makeshift barriers, turning his humble dwelling into a fortress. He knew it wouldn't hold off a determined assault for long, but it would buy them time. As he worked, a flicker of his former self began to emerge. The spark that had been extinguished by tragedy began to glow once more. He rediscovered his courage, his fighting spirit, the qualities that had made him a respected rancher and a loyal friend. He remembered the training his father had given him, the lessons he had learned about marksmanship, horsemanship, and survival. He remembered the battles he had fought alongside his father, defending their ranch from rustlers and claim jumpers. Those skills, long dormant, began to resurface, honed by years of solitary existence in the wilderness. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It was a dangerous feeling, but also an exhilarating one. He was no longer just existing. He was fighting for something, for someone. He was fighting for Sarah, for his own redemption, for the memory of his family. He looked at Sarah, who was watching him with admiration and gratitude. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw a newfound hope. He knew that he couldn't let her down. He would protect her, no matter the cost. He would face Caleb and his gang, and he would emerge victorious. He was Jedediah Stone, and he was ready to fight. The years of solitude are over. Caleb made a big mistake coming for him. The storm had subsided to a drizzle, casting a gray pall over the landscape, mirroring the grim task ahead. Jed, now fully embracing his role as protector, enlisted Sarah's help in preparing for Caleb's arrival. The initial awkwardness between them dissolved as they worked together, their shared purpose forging a bond of trust. Jed, drawing on his knowledge of the surrounding terrain, began setting traps around the cabin. He dug pits, camouflaging them with leaves and branches. He strung tripwires, connecting them to noisemakers that would alert them to the bandits' approach. Sarah, despite her weakened state, proved to be a quick learner, her resourcefulness surprising Jed. She gathered rocks to create makeshift projectiles and helped him sharpen sticks into stakes. Inside the cabin, they planned their defense, assigning each other positions and strategizing their movements. Jed taught Sarah how to load and fire his spare rifle, emphasizing safety and accuracy. He showed her how to use the cabin's limited cover to her advantage, minimizing her exposure to enemy fire. As they worked side by side, a connection began to form between them, a silent understanding that transcended words. Jed found himself admiring Sarah's courage and resilience, her unwavering belief in him. Sarah, in turn, saw beneath Jed's gruff exterior, recognizing the kind and honorable man he truly was. They shared stories, snippets of their lives before the storm brought them together. Jed spoke of his family, of the ranch, of the dreams that had been stolen from him. Sarah revealed that she had been a teacher, dedicated to helping children learn and grow. She had stumbled upon information about Caleb's gang while researching a historical project and had been forced to flee for her life. Their shared vulnerability created a space for affection to blossom. It wasn't a passionate, fiery love, but rather a gentle, comforting warmth that eased their fears and strengthened their resolve. Jed found himself wanting to protect Sarah not just out of obligation, but also out of a growing tenderness for her. Sarah, in turn, found solace and strength in Jed's presence, trusting him with her life. The arrival of Caleb's men wasn't going to be easy, but together they will be prepared. After seeing her strength, Jed now felt he could do this. Together, they will survive. The quiet of the morning was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Jed and Sarah exchanged a look, their hearts pounding in their chests. This was it. The moment of truth had arrived. Jed peered through a crack in the barricaded window, his eyes scanning the approaching figures. He counted 6 men, their faces grim and determined. They were heavily armed, their rifles glinting in the dim light. And leading them, riding a black stallion, was Caleb. He had changed. The years had etched lines of cruelty on his face, transforming him from the trusted foreman Jed remembered into a ruthless bandit. His eyes, once filled with warmth and camaraderie, were now cold and hard, reflecting a soul consumed by greed and bitterness. The bandits surrounded the cabin, their horses snorting and pawing the ground. Caleb dismounted, his gaze fixed on the barricaded door. He raised his voice, his words echoing through the clearing. "Jedediah Stone," he shouted, "I know you're in there. Come out, and maybe I'll let the woman live." Jed remained silent, his grip tightening on his rifle. He wouldn't give Caleb the satisfaction of seeing his fear. He wouldn't let him use Sarah as leverage. "I know you're protecting her," Caleb continued, his voice laced with menace. "But you can't hide forever. I'm giving you one last chance. Come out now, and tell me where the gold is, and I promise I'll make it quick." Still, Jed remained silent. He had made his decision. He would fight to protect Sarah, to protect the memory of his family, to protect what little peace he had managed to find in the mountains. Caleb sighed, a sound filled with false regret. "All right, Jedediah," he said, "you asked for this." He gestured to his men, and they began to dismount, preparing for an assault. The tense standoff stretched on, the silence broken only by the creaking of the cabin and the rustling of the wind through the trees. Jed knew that the calm wouldn't last. Soon, the bullets would fly, and the battle for his life would begin. He looked at Sarah, offering her a reassuring smile. He was ready. He was Jedediah Stone, and he would not go down without a fight. The years of running is over. Now it is time for the hunter to become the hunted. The game is about to begin. Caleb's patience ran out. With a curt nod, he signaled his men to attack. The air exploded with gunfire, the bullets ripping through the cabin walls and shattering the windows. Jed and Sarah ducked for cover, the sound of the assault deafening. The gunfight was fierce and unrelenting. Jed, drawing on years of experience, returned fire with deadly accuracy, picking off the bandits one by one. He moved swiftly and strategically, using the cabin's limited cover to his advantage. Sarah, despite her lack of experience, proved to be a quick learner and a valuable asset. She followed Jed's instructions, firing her rifle with surprising accuracy and keeping the bandits at bay. The traps they had set earlier proved to be effective, slowing down the bandits' advance and inflicting casualties. One bandit fell into a pit, another tripped a wire, setting off a cacophony of noise that momentarily disoriented the attackers. Jed knew that they couldn't hold out forever. The bandits were relentless, and their numbers were dwindling. They needed to find a way to turn the tide of the battle. He glanced at Sarah, offering her a quick nod. It was time to put their plan into action. He knew this was going to be tough, but he knew they could get through it. Taking advantage of a lull in the firing, Jed threw a Molotov cocktail he crafted from a bottle and some cloth. The makeshift bomb sailed through the air and landed near the bandits' horses, setting them ablaze. The horses panicked, their screams adding to the chaos. Sarah, meanwhile, grabbed a handful of rocks and hurled them at the bandits, distracting them and giving Jed time to reload. She may be small, but she was fast. The gunfight raged on, the cabin a scene of destruction. Bullets whizzed through the air, the smell of gunpowder filled the air, and the screams of the wounded echoed through the clearing. Jed and Sarah fought bravely, defending themselves and the cabin against overwhelming odds. The cabin was now Jed's sanctuary, and he would do anything to protect it. The bandits, now fewer in number and demoralized by the loss of their horses, began to retreat into the surrounding woods. Only Caleb remained, standing defiantly in the clearing, his face contorted with rage. "This isn't over, Jedediah," he roared, his voice filled with hatred. "I'm not leaving without that gold." Jed stepped out of the cabin, his rifle held at the ready. He motioned for Sarah to stay inside, knowing that the final confrontation would be between him and Caleb. He had to face his demons alone. He walked slowly towards Caleb, his eyes fixed on the man who had betrayed him, the man who had destroyed his life. The years of pent-up anger and grief surged through him, threatening to overwhelm him. "There is no gold, Caleb," Jed said, his voice low and dangerous. "You've wasted your life chasing a lie." "Don't lie to me, Jedediah," Caleb spat. "I know your father hid it somewhere, and I'm going to find it, even if I have to tear this whole mountain apart." Caleb lunged at Jed, throwing a wild punch. Jed dodged the blow and retaliated with a swift kick to Caleb's chest. The two men grappled, their bodies colliding in a brutal hand-to-hand fight. They wrestled on the ground, exchanging blows, their bodies covered in mud and blood. Jed, despite his age and years of solitude, was a formidable fighter. He drew on his strength and his training, matching Caleb blow for blow. The fight was more than just physical. It was a battle for Jed's soul. He had to overcome his fear and his rage, to forgive himself for the past and embrace the future. Caleb, fueled by greed and desperation, fought with a savage intensity. He clawed and bit, determined to win at any cost. Finally, Jed managed to gain the upper hand. He pinned Caleb to the ground, his fist raised to strike the final blow. But as he looked into Caleb's eyes, he saw not triumph, but despair. He saw the man he had once known, the man who had been consumed by darkness. Jed hesitated, his anger dissipating, replaced by a profound sadness. He couldn't kill Caleb. He couldn't become the monster that Caleb had become. Instead, he lowered his fist and said, "It's over, Caleb. Just let it go." The fight inside of him was now over. Caleb, defeated and broken, simply nodded. Jed stood up and walked away, leaving Caleb to wallow in his own misery. The man who had haunted Jed for years was finally defeated, not by violence, but by compassion. He had now finally released him. Jed felt he could now breathe again. With Caleb defeated and his gang scattered, a sense of peace settled over the clearing, a stark contrast to the violence that had just transpired. Jed helped Sarah back into the cabin, tending to her minor wounds with a gentleness that belied his rough exterior. As they cleaned up the mess, a thought occurred to Jed. Caleb had been so certain about the gold, so driven by the belief that it existed. What if it was real? What if his father had hidden it, not telling Jed because he feared for his son's safety? He remembered his father's words on his deathbed. His father had said, "It is under the stone, Jed." Jed looked at Sarah, a determined glint in his eyes. "There's something I need to check," he said. "Stay here and lock the door." He ventured outside, his rifle in hand, his gaze sweeping the surrounding area. He walked towards a large, moss-covered boulder a short distance from the cabin, a boulder he had passed countless times without giving it a second thought. This time he was going to do it. He knelt beside the boulder, running his hands over its rough surface. He remembered his father's words, echoing in his mind. "It is under the stone." Jed then began to see if he could move it. After a few minutes, Jed had managed to move the rock. Beneath the boulder, nestled in a small cavity, was a wooden box, its surface weathered and worn. Jed's heart pounded in his chest as he lifted the box, its weight confirming his suspicions. This was it, the hidden gold. He carried the box back to the cabin and set on the table. Jed slowly opened the box. The box was filled with gold coins and stacks of paper money, a fortune that had been hidden for years. It was more than enough to rebuild the stone ranch and secure their future. Jed looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. "It's real," he said, his voice trembling. "The gold, it's real." He had a choice to make. He could keep the gold for himself, using it to live a life of luxury and ease. But that wasn't what his father would have wanted. His father would have wanted him to use it to honor their family's memory, to rebuild the ranch, and create a place where others could find solace and peace. Jed made his decision. He would use the gold to rebuild the stone ranch, the place where he learned how to be a man, where he met his wife. His kids would have loved it there. He had to make sure everyone got to feel that love as well. He would rebuild it for his parents. He would rebuild it for his wife and kids. He would rebuild it for himself and Sarah. And he would do it together with Sarah by his side. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clear, blue sky and a sense of renewal. Jed and Sarah stood outside the cabin, surveying the damage from the gunfight. It was a reminder of the violence they had endured, but also a testament to their resilience and their shared determination to survive. They had been through so much together. The storm, the bandits, the fear, the loss, and the rediscovery of hope. They had forged a bond that was stronger than any adversity, a bond that was built on trust, respect, and a growing affection. Jed looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with love and gratitude. "What do you say, Sarah?" he asked, his voice gentle. "You want to stay here with me? Help me rebuild the ranch? Help me build a new life?" Sarah smiled, her eyes sparkling with happiness. "I can't think of anything I'd rather do," she said. "I've always wanted a home of my own, and now I have one. With you." They embraced, their hearts filled with hope and excitement. They knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Rebuilding the stone ranch would be a long and arduous task, but they were ready for the challenge. Together, they would clear the debris, repair the buildings, and cultivate the land. They would plant crops, raise livestock, and welcome travelers to their ranch. They would create a place where others could find solace and peace, a place where the spirit of Jed's family would live on. They would also heal. Jed would finally come to terms with his past, forgiving himself for the loss of his family and embracing the possibility of a new beginning. Sarah would find a sense of purpose and belonging, putting her teaching skills to use by educating the children of the surrounding communities. They would build a life filled with love, laughter, and adventure. They would explore the mountains, ride horses through the valleys, and watch the sunset over the vast, open plains. They would embrace the beauty and the challenges of the Wild West, facing whatever the future held with courage and determination. As they stood there, hand in hand, gazing at the horizon, they knew that they had found something special, something that was worth fighting for. They had found love, they had found hope, and they had found a new life in the West, a life that was just beginning. And they would spend their lives together. Jed and Sarah. They will build the best life imaginable. Jed thought of his parents, and he knew they would have loved Sarah. The end.